And just a quick reminder for everybody, we've got a really big group today, which is super exciting. And we have Ryan Patrick here. I'll let Sue kind of do formal intros in just a minute. But this is a collaborative, non-compete space. We keep it super friendly and very casual. So Sue, I'll pass it off.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everybody for joining. Donna's right. We have a pretty big group. Not everybody's on camera, and that's okay. We ask that if you're comfortable being on camera when you're speaking or asking a question or bringing up a thought, then by all means join with the camera. But you're fine to lurk and just kind of see what this group is all about. But we basically meet every Thursday at this time to go through anything high trust related. We've often talked about the fact that high trust isn't just a compliance framework, it's a way of life. It's a way of reorganizing your organization. And there's a huge learning curve when you're first starting out with high trust. And so, what we try to do here is break down any questions that you have before, during, and even after. And so, we're exceedingly thrilled today to have Ryan Patrick. He's the VP of Adoption at High Trust. And it's kind of an ask me anything for Ryan. He can take it. Trust me, I've seen him on stage at the High Trust Collaborate conference, and getting those slings and arrows. Be polite, obviously, but be willing to ask any tough questions that you have. So, Ryan, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself, kind of how you got to High Trust, and what your goals and objectives are with being the VP of Adoption.
Yeah, so first off, thanks for inviting me. This is actually my second meeting. I was a lurker the last time I was on. I don't think I said much at all. But my background is primarily, the United States Army, did about 20 years in the Army, but also in healthcare cybersecurity. So I worked, prior to coming to High Trust, I worked for several different external assessor firms. Think of like managed services firms, professional service firms. I did everything from pen testing to risk assessments to tabletop exercises. I'm not saying I was any good at any one of those things, but I did all of that type of work. But the last couple of positions I had, I actually ran the high trust practice for those organizations. So I've been working with the framework since 2013. So I've seen lots of changes, and I've seen lots of evolution. So I like to refer to myself as High Trust's biggest advocate, but also High Trust's biggest critic. And I like to hear from the market on things that, obviously what we're doing well, we want to sustain that, but I also want to hear, thoughts for improvement, or I want to dispel myths. There's lots of myths about high trust. So for this, um, it is an open forum. Sue, in coordinating this, you had mentioned carve outs. Happy to cover carve outs a little bit, see if there's any specific questions there. But in my role at High Trust, I've been here over 3 years now. I have many hats. I am an evangelist, so I'm constantly out presenting publicly and educating the market on the things that High Trust is doing. But I work really closely with folks like Richard over at Linford and the other external assessor firms to overcome challenges, answer questions, strategize. Like there's tons of times where I go to Richard and I'm like, hey, we're thinking about doing X, Y, or Z. What's your take? Because I don't believe we should be building things in a vacuum. And the more feedback and collaboration we have with the market, the better the solution that we bring to the market is. And I'm probably an overcompensated customer success manager sometimes, and I do a lot of putting out fires when things are not going well. And I think most people that are on this call at some point in their high trust journey got really frustrated and really annoyed, and
Yes, exactly. And that's part of what we're trying to do here is to kind of alleviate some of that frustration, or in that, yeah, we're all in it together.
Commiserate.
Yeah, commiserate. We've seen it, we've done it. And carve outs
Yeah.
came up last week because it's kind of a detailed kind of niche thing that I had seen in the assessor handbook. We can get started with that topic, but I figured if there were kind of more broad general topics that people had about like what you're seeing, changes in the industry. I know CMMC is a topic that we've talked about before, and how that fits in, how your high trust certification would fit in if you are a business associate that's going to be supporting somebody who's, doing healthcare for a federal government agency. And so, how does that work? How are you kind of positioning, because you're based on and mapping to NIST 853 and CMMC is NIST 800-171, and kind of where does that play and what's maybe in the future for, a better alignment or mapping from CMMC to HITRUST?
Yeah, I can definitely touch on CMMC. But let's start with carve outs.
Okay.
So carve outs, much like significant changes, is to our community feels like a moving target. It's kind of confusing. But bottom line is historically, High Trust has not believed in the concept of carve outs. We believe in holistic, comprehensive assessments, the full tech stack, and all of the governance that go into managing that tech stack. So for the 16, 17 years that we only had the R2, carve-outs weren't allowed. So if you were working with an outsourced provider, whether that's a CSP or some other managed service provider, they had to be in scope of your assessment. You could not say, well, my endpoints are being managed by this firm over here, so I'm not going to test my endpoints. Yes, those endpoints were going to be tested for the R2. Now, for the E1 and the I1, um, we do allow carve outs. So you can carve those things out. And you could argue it's a departure from kind of our religion to a certain extent, but the way that we look at our assessments is they provide a higher level of assurance and a higher level of trust compared to most things out there in the industry. But the E1 and the I1 are a lower level than the R2, so some flexibility, especially when you consider the folks that are pursuing, say, an E1, they're probably in startup mode, they're small, they're under-resourced, so having some flexibility there, we thought was an important design consideration. I will tell you that maybe it's because we have this religion and we've had it for 19 years now. We don't see many carve-outs, even with the E1 and the I1, even though it's allowed.
Well, and that's what we were kind of talking about last week was the hypothetical of, okay, in what business case would you do it? And I guess for the most part, when I look at external providers, they're typically, the cloud service providers who do have a high trust certification. So external inheritance can be used, or they have some sort of a SOC 2 or some sort of auditing. So reliance can be used. So we were kind of thinking, okay, well, what would you carve out? Somebody that's not gone through an audit? And is that really a testament to, yeah, I'm using this really cruddy business associate of mine, so don't pay any attention to them. And, we were trying to figure out what that business case would be so that if we did have somebody that came along that we go, hey, this might be useful for you, but it doesn't bode well if you're doing that because your providers aren't up to snuff.
Yeah, like I said, it doesn't happen often. The only time I've kind of seen it happen is if there was some kind of outsourced business processing organization that was doing some back office type of stuff for the system in scope, and you would carve their environment out from the scope of the subjected assessment. That's really all I've seen.
Okay.
But I would offer to the community and to your group here that if you have questions about specific questions about carve outs, like let's say you come across somebody who is like legitimately wants to carve something out, get us involved. Like we're actually way more accessible than people realize, and we want to be a part of the solution. And I will tell you that we have hard rules, but we're also collaborative and we're, I don't want to say malleable, but we're willing to work with organizations while maintaining those rules to meet them where they are.
Okay. Sounds good.
So, Ryan, I've got a kind of a related question on that. So, with carve outs in E1s and I1, so the breach rate of less than 1% was published. It's really exciting. Obviously there are a lot of organizations who, look around at near constant barrage of news stories about, breaches and issues and, being able to strive towards something that will meaningfully help mitigate that risk is so important. Um, and so I guess my question is two-pronged. One, how would you position, when I'm talking to a client who's debating between an R2 and an I1, or an E1, how do my understanding is the less than 1% breach rate is encompassing all three of those frameworks. So then how would I inspire somebody to go from startup mode at an E1 or an I1 to R2? If they turn around to me and they're saying, well, I get the same, protection, so to speak, with the smaller framework. And, why would I kind of put the burden on myself and all the extra time and investment? And then whatever that kind of outcome is, will HITRUST potentially be monitoring any carve out assessments separately, just in case those have a shift or a deviation from that breach rate?
So I'll start with the second question.
Okay.
I have not heard of a plan to specifically monitor carve-out assessments. Again, they're fractional at this point. They would just fall into the same processes that we have for reporting and monitoring breaches, right?
Mhm.
So there's a couple of mechanisms that we have that there's lots of questions. And the first year we put it out, when we put it out in 2024, it was 0.62, I think, percent. Like I talked to Vinny, our compliance officer, and I was like, yeah, there's no way. Like, how are we less than 1%? Like, go back and do the math. The market's not even gonna like, they're gonna think this is the most ridiculous number ever. And like, he's like, no, I've done the math like 8 times. Like, this is
Yeah.
where it's at. Um, so people also ask us, well, reporting's voluntary. You're not capturing all the breaches within high trust certified environments. And my response is we arguably have a three-pronged approach that negates that thought process. One, we contractually require all of our customers who are certified to report to us if there's a security incident. Like, we use breach as a broad term. Ultimately, we're talking about security incidents. Most of the ones, if not all of the incidents that we've seen have been breaches, and that's, I think, why we called it a breach rate. But so we contractually require. The second thing we do, and Richard can attest to this, is when he does an assessment, there's a question he has to ask of the organization. Have you had an incident, a breach in this environment in the last year, right? So our external assessors find out and have to report it to us. And the last thing we do is we monitor open source information. We're looking at the news. We're ingesting the wall of shame and things of that nature. So is it perfect? Absolutely not. But and then what I like to tell people is, even if we're off by 15%, our margin of error is 15%, which would be a really, really high margin of error. We're still drastically lower than the industry averages from a breach rate. So there's something to it, and I have my own opinions on why we have such a low breach rate, which I can bore you with if you want. But now I completely forgot what your first question was, Donna.
That's okay. It was the compelling investment in the
Oh, right.
R2 versus the E1 and the I1.
Yeah, so I'm going to put on different hats as I talk, right? So as a security professional, I would tug at their heartstrings around, hey, this is what you need to do to protect yourself and your organization. And, yes, there's a low breach rate, which is inclusive of an E1. Understand that the population of an E1 is a lot smaller than R2 right now. And same thing with I1. The overwhelming majority of certified high trust customers at this point are R2, which is really driving that number to where it is. So I would say, hey, you should be getting better over time. You should be evolving over time, and you need to build processes and programs in order to adapt and respond and be resilient in case there is an issue down the line. And that's where the R2 comes in. The E1 and the I1 is solely focused on implemented controls. The R2, you have to demonstrate that you have policies and processes that govern these controls. So that's where that resiliency and that ability to react comes into place. Now, taking off my security hat and putting on my reality hat, business guy, like not everybody has the resources, not everybody has the time, not everybody has the money, not everybody has a customer telling them that they need to provide something like an
Mhm.
R2. So there is a world where the E1 or the I1 is a destination. And for an organization that presents low risk to their customers or their business partners, that may be their destination. Putting my security back hat
Yeah.
back on, I would love for them to, do the most robust thing that's just going to protect them more and more. But I also have to realize that they're trying to run a business,
Yeah.
and you have to balance those two.
Yeah. No, and I wonder if there are or will be, as the longevity of the I1 and the E1, just kind of year over year statistics increase, about the right size and nature of organizations that are best served by those. If you've got a 40 or 50 person organization, I imagine it would be really difficult and incredibly cumbersome to try and seek an R2, where an organization that's, say, 1,000 employees, I can't imagine an E1 would serve them very well. Just purely by the complexity of an organization that has 1,000 employees. But those are just, shooting from the hip a bit. And it would be great to, just understand a little bit more about how, because a lot of us on the call right now are, professionals that work with clients who have these questions, and we want to be able to provide informed responses that help guide good decisions for their organizations. I would hate to recommend an R to an organization that really would be better served, both investment and monetary balance for their entity, by an E1 or an I1, or
Yeah,
equally served, I should say.
yeah, no, I totally get it. I did that for 10 years. I'd had customers come to me and then they would want to know what's the right answer. And the question that I normally would ask them right back is, why are you here? Like, why are you asking me about high trust? Is it because someone's asking you to get high trust certified? If the answer is yes, you should ask them what's appropriate for you because it's their risk that they're trying to wrap their arms around and manage, the risk you present to them. Now, if it's because you want to differentiate yourself in the market, that may only require an E1 or an I1. So it really is, it's more about business drivers than
Mhm.
market segmentation, right? Because I could argue that a 10 company person that consumes all of United's data is pretty risky. And they're tiny. They're a small organization,
It's
but
fair
they're
enough.
pretty darn risky and they need to do an R2. And this is one of my more favorite stories to tell that I don't get to tell as much anymore. When I was an external assessor, I got a two-person shop, two people, husband and a wife team, R2 certified. So it's possible. I don't know how their marriage survived, but it's possible. And it took some time, but it's not. High trust is hard because people aren't ready for it. It's not hard because it's impossible.
Mhm.
And if you look at year one versus say year three of an organization, and Sue, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this based on your background. Year one is really difficult because you've just gotten smashed in the face if you're doing an R2, 370 requirements, whatever the average is today. And you're like, holy moly, I'm not doing all of this stuff. And I definitely don't have policies that actually govern this. So I need to rewrite everything. And it takes a ton of time. But once you achieve that, once you've climbed to the top of the mountain, getting recertified, as long as you do your work, like you said in the beginning, like this is an everyday thing. You need to be living and breathing it. It's not that difficult. Yes, Richard's going to come in and he is going to rock your world for 90 days during validation, but getting to the validation point isn't as difficult in maintaining the certification as it is achieving the certification. So people have to like they think internalize that. And where I've seen organizations fail in the past is they don't do that. Like I would tell my customers, hey, certification day, party. Certification day plus one, recover from the party. Certification plus two, get back to work because you need to already be preparing for the things that are coming down the line. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a hard thing because I just had a client that went through an E1 and the first thing they asked me is still, the report's still in draft mode and they're like, so when are we going to start this again? And I was like, you're asking the right question, but I'm surprised you're asking that. So
That's good.
and I was like, well, we probably have 6 months, but I will be checking in, quarterly at least to say, keep on this, keep on this. Here's some new things. And we talked about that last week with, maintaining that relationship with a validated assessor as well as your, I'm more in the role of that readiness person, but to have that so that you've got that, what are the new things coming from High Trust? What are the things that have changed in your organization? And make sure that they aren't, there's not going to be any surprises down the road. Because I think that's the biggest thing the first time through is, you're hit with, like you said, 350, 400 requirements, and there's one or two that are just that gotcha. And you're like, I don't even know how to evidence that, two people are responsible for all of our social media and public facing websites. And I'm gonna have to take a zero on that because we don't name them and say these are the only people, and we don't have specific training for them. So you've kind of gotten into that detail level, and you're like, I have a great data privacy and protection program, but I skipped that one because I didn't realize that was an issue. So that's why we've gone through like the top 10 things that have been, the things that stop people from getting
The
certified.
tripping
And so,
points.
yeah,
Yeah.
your annual report is great for that because it helps with some of those things that people stumble on. But that's, I think, the hardest part about this is that there's really no way to prepare in advance. There's not like you can do a high trust light or because even the E1 and the I1, you say it's only implementation, but a lot of those implementation controls will say as described in your policy. So you need a policy. So, there's probably at least a third, I would say, just off the cuff about that you still need policies in place. So you still need that maturity walking into it. But yeah, I kind of agree with the conversation about R2 is unless you've got a compelling, your largest customer or group of your customer saying you will get to that level, you can still create an assessment and look at all those controls and say, this is what would be, these are the things we should be doing, but I don't necessarily have to go through a validated assessment to prove all that. I can put some of these into place. I can look at where we should be going, but year two, I don't necessarily need to move up to an R2. I can usually maybe stay with an E1 or an I1 for a couple of years and then, kind of mature my process as I go, unless you've got a customer saying, nope, R2 within 2 or 3 years, which
Right.
I've had, when I was working at a very large company, new environment goes out and the customers are like, well, I know you can't be certified right during go live, and I was like, yeah, thank you. Thanks for
Mm,
recognizing it has to be in place for 90 days, but they're like, but within the next 18 months we want you certified. So he's like, okay, got a deadline, I'm good.
yeah. Yeah, I would offer that when we released the E1 and the I1, there was I don't want to call it concern, but there was consideration put into the idea of cannibalizing the R2. Not that we care from like our business model perspective, whatever's right for the organization is right for them. We've actually haven't seen that cannibalization happen. The only time, I mean, there's always one-offs, but the only time I've seen generally that folks will, I don't want to say downgrade, but go from R2 to something else is folks who have stalled in getting initially certified. The R2 was just too big of a bear to wrap their arms around. So they went backwards and they said, hey, let's just start out with an E1. We can achieve something. Because what we've danced around this a little bit, but what people need to realize is like one of the toughest parts about high trust is building the culture around it, right? And understanding it because we are our own animal. Just like CMMC is its own animal and FedRAMP's its own animal. We're our own animal, and you have to learn how to understand that animal. So biting off a smaller chunk makes sense in my mind. So it's okay for you to say, I'm going to take a knee, I'm going to drink some water, and I'm going to do an E1 and step back from the R2. But generally speaking, the R2 is still growing. The
Yeah.
E1 is the fastest growing for new customers at this point, but the R2 is still growing as well. So I don't think you're gonna see a lot of organizations park on the E1. I think over time they'll mature.
Yeah. And I do really appreciate the fact that they all feed into the next so that it's not a completely different set of controls or some overlap. It's, completely an E1. All of those controls are fully contained in an I1 and it's just a plus. It's just adding more to it. And the same with the R2. I know it was a little bit chaotic when they first came out, and you kind of expect that when you're figuring it out and the market's figuring it out. But I really, really feedback from, yay, Rob, please do keep doing that.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember. I'm pretty sure Richard remembers when we released the I1, which was first. The I1 was not nested into the R2, and he was one of the first people to come to me and be like, "What the heck are you guys doing? Like, this is a terrible idea." And I was like, you know what? It is a terrible idea. Now, in my defense, it was the design happened before I joined HITRUST, but the good news is like we listened to the market and we changed it the next year. And that's when we nested the entire portfolio and we gave people, I like to call it an on-ramp to HITRUST. You know, you can start with the E1 and graduate over time to the R2 and it's working out for organizations.
And that right there is a great selling point of high trust, especially for organizations that are just getting started. The E1 is a great on ramp. And as a firm, we do see a pretty strong movement of organizations up the chain. They do the E1 and then they tend to move up to the
Yeah.
I1.
Yep.
And we have I1 clients that are moving up to the R2, but it's just a matter of maturity. And that's a great point. Some organizations, they just take time to get there to be able to build that culture. And the biggest challenge with the R2 is that culture has got to be in place.
For sure.
The E1 and the I1, since they're very implementation focused, you can push a lot of it through, but when you get into the R2, it's just a different beast from that standpoint.
For sure. Yeah, I think I think we're going to see the relevancy of the R2 play a more prominent role as I, along with others on the Hydra side, are able to work with other, we use the term governing bodies, standards bodies, you know, think the FedRAMPs, the GovRAMPs, the CMMCs of the world, as we start to build acceptance between the two, right? Because what world does it make sense for an organization that needs to do high trust, but also wants to do business with the federal government and wants to do business with the state government, that they have to do three individual assessments that probably will cost them several millions of dollars to do that are arguably covering the same controls. So why wouldn't the standards bodies, and I use that term very, very loosely, work together and make it easier for the community? And we're seeing that. But you know, specifically for FedRAMP, if you're paying attention to FedRAMP 20X, it's the E1's not going to satisfy. It may help depending on how FedRAMP 20X unfolds, but the R2 is going to be that robust assessment that the FedRAMP PMO will be able to rely on. And the work we're doing right now with the pilot we have with GovRAMP, which I can give an update on, that's all based on the R2. So I don't think like if you look at and not feel like I always pick on the SOC 2, and I'm not picking on it, but it's a classic example. Like if you look at what's happening in the industry right now around the drive to the bottom from a SOC 2 perspective, from a like for cost, right? I don't think that possible in the high trust world. Like you can't drive the price down to $2,500 like people are quoting for SOC 2s now. It's not possible. Um, so I think each will kind of stand on its own merit and it'll be used as it makes sense to be used based on whatever the circumstances are.
Yeah, I mean, from a cost perspective, Ryan, I'm sure you've heard me say this before. If you can't afford a high trust assessment, you absolutely cannot afford to be in court or, dealing with the fines and things afterwards. I mean, if your data is sensitive and falling into that realm, it's important to make sure you understand what the implications are. And now that the FTC regulations are expanding to, change what consumers can pursue as far as civil litigation, and include their own data privacy, that puts an entirely different spin on what companies could be fighting in court. That's just a very different dynamic. A lot of organizations, I think, they might not have felt protected, but they've been, they could be reported for something or have an investigation, but it wasn't something that they could necessarily be sued over in the same way that the world is changing, and would open up doors in that capacity in the future.
Yeah, it's a great point, and we're seeing more and more, primarily at the state level, legislation or policy coming out around safe harbor, and in some cases, high trust is listed as safe harbor. So if you have achieved high trust, if there is something that happens, the fines wouldn't be as steep or as punitive. I think we're going to see more of that happen across the country, maybe at the federal level. The federal government is kind of a mess right now. And it's stalled in a lot of things that it's trying to do. So I don't see a lot of legislation or policy coming out until they can um, figure out what DOJ is doing and how do they start to actually pass legislation in Congress, like those types of things. But yeah, I think there's momentum. There's a there's a wave building around, hey, what we've done to date doesn't work. It's not helping organizations. Questionnaires don't reduce risk. SOC 2 doesn't reduce risk. HIPAA does not reduce risk. And they're looking for alternatives. And the good news for High Trust is we have a really strong brand. People realize, because I've been running around for 13 years saying High Trust is a significant emotional event, that it's hard and you actually have to get better in order to achieve it. That we're becoming one of the alternatives. So we'll see how it all unfolds.
Well, you brought up a point before about, having that support and being safe harbor if something does happen. I know in the past, High Trust had an offering that if OCR came and audited, or if there was an event or something like that, that they would kind of go to bat for you. Does that still happen? Because I didn't see anything on the website about that lately.
It's so funny. I was just in a strategy session the past 4 days with the executive team and the board for iTrust. And that specific thing came up because I don't think this group knows. I actually have responsibility over government affairs at iTrust now. So we're talking about OCR and HHS, and that question came up. And the program technically still exists. Nobody takes advantage of it.
I mean, I know OCR put the hold on audits, during COVID and all that, and I don't know if they've ever gotten back to it. So I think that's part of it potentially. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a huge selling point, to know that if something does happen and if if you do have a HIPAA violation or something, if you've been high trust certified, you can go in with somebody with your back, and not have to face it alone.
And to that point, HITRUST was not listed under the federal safe harbor for HHS for HIPAA. But I feel pretty comfortable that I could convince HHS that HITRUST goes above and beyond any of the other things that they put on that list.
Well, and I think that would be compelling for covered entities because I know for a lot of times covered entities are, I just want to make sure that, if something happens and HIPAA comes, and HHS comes along, I want to make sure that I'm not going to get in trouble, that I've done the due diligence, but they don't necessarily want to go through the rigor of a high trust certification. Whereas business associates, hey, I've got a covered entity that's requiring this of me. So I think that would be helpful as far as making it viable for a covered entity, a hospital or, some sort of medical service organization to say, oh, it's not my patients that are asking for this, but it's my board of directors because they want to show that I've done due diligence over and above HIPAA compliance.
Right. Yeah. Along that line, there's actually maybe little known uh, an offering, so to speak, a free service from HITRUST that if you have a customer that is not accepting your HITRUST, you can call basically me, and I will get on the phone and educate your customer on the merits of HITRUST. That happens, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 times a year. We'll have a customer say, "Hey, I need you to talk to my customer because, I went out and got an R2 and they want to send me a questionnaire and they're
Or they just want a SOC 2 instead.
I didn't want to say it, but yes. Yeah.
Huh.
Or an ISO. I mean, there's ISO, PCI, whatever. I mean, there's so many others that when you get into that conversation around like how is the R2 just functionally different, even then, and you can also draw comparisons between some of the other frameworks and the I-1. The I-1 has significantly more coverage than some of the more common frameworks.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree. And,
Well,
what's
the
funny
funniest.
is,
Oh,
let me
go ahead.
one comment, Donna. I'm not going to name the name, but there's a large payer here in the country who um, asks for HITRUST from their vendors. You achieve HITRUST, and then they still send you a questionnaire. And the questionnaire are the HITRUST controls. You're basically redoing the same thing. And so I worked with that large payer, and they've now removed that requirement for HITRUST certified organizations. So it
And
can work.
that's excellent because one of the most frustrating things for me was seeing, when I was fully client side, I was really frustrated at the TPRM council members who would require high trust and then send their 400 questions through. And I thought, this is absolutely ridiculous. Like, I used to actually send through to our sales team the list of clients who were on TPRM and should not be asking for questionnaires to be completed, because those are things that should map and to a client's favor if they've gone through the trouble of getting an R2. And that was an R2 in that circumstance, not any sort of a kind of an E1 or an I1. But anyways.
Yeah. I one of my favorite things to ask in that conversation is, and it's going to sound really obtuse the way I say it. I delivered a little softer. Is who are you to think that your questions matter in a questionnaire? Think about that for a second.
Mhm.
Like Ryan Patrick, who the heck are you to say that these 300 questions are the most important questions in the world to drive down risk? Do you analyze threat data? Are you picking apart incidents to understand the TTPs? The answer is probably no. They probably were like, oh, I'll just pull some controls out of 853, or I'm going to use the NIST CSF. Well, the NIST CSF doesn't have any controls in it. It's a reporting framework. So it does give those audiences a second of pause because they're like, wait a second, I'm heads down all day dealing with vendors, just chasing them to complete these questionnaires. I'm not looking at the industry at large and the threat landscape at large. So what do I know? you know? Sometimes it works. Sometimes they
Mm.
get indignant, but it's all part of the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, uh, it still makes me cringe a bit to see how much money is spent on the whole questionnaire cycle when there are healthcare organizations and other entities in the healthcare realm who could be spending that money to really drive fundamental change or improvement or serve their customer base better. It breaks my heart when I hear of hospitals or healthcare organizations shutting down wards or struggling to, you know, maintain the number of nurses and doctors they need to, serve their patient community. And at the same time, those organizations are sending out, questionnaires with hundreds of questions, and they're not it's not delivering value for their organization. So that part of it is a bit more heartbreaking. But it's a longer journey. Some of these folks they're not ready to take that next step, but it's hard. All right, so any other questions on that? Because I actually do have another question, but it shifts topic a bit. I don't want to jump ahead of anybody. Okay. Continuous monitoring, continuous assessment. So as we go through and drive forward, and most of us on this call are big believers that high trust is a way of life. And once you fully engage and you're a believer and you drink the Kool-Aid, achieving that and maintaining that is much easier than that first climb up the mountain. And trying to make sure that those things are put in place so that when CIOs change or CISOs change or key managers change, that things don't fall off track and end up with a bit of a mess, or you got to climb partway back up the mountain again next time. um, Turning to continuous assessment and knowing that the marketplace is flooded with AI tools. And I know that AI is not the answer for everything, but it can be pretty savvy and very helpful sometimes. And I'm just wondering whether High Trust has a kind of finger on the pulse of the future in that realm. It's kind of bounced in and out a little bit over the past several years. But even things like if I put a document that, meets a certain control for meeting minutes or agendas or formalities or something, is there an AI that can say, right, tick, 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 and then we get to the next assessment and we've not got all the evidence we need, but a good cross section.
So I am happy to report that High Trust is moving towards continuous assurance. And based on the last 4 days, I would say that you will see our first continuous assurance assessment by the end of Q1 2026. And what does that mean? It means, like, if you think about a high trust assessment life cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start here, there's this huge spike of activity, effort, cost, time, stress, pain, all that stuff, and then it dies. And then there's flat line, and then a
Mm-hmm.
year later it spikes, and then it dies, so on and so forth. With continuous assurance, there's two possible ways. One definitely is going to happen. There's a second one being debated, which I'm happy to share. I don't think it's sensitive. There'll still be the initial spike. You have to achieve the initial certification, but you're never going to come all the way back down. You're going
Mm-hmm.
to stay here and you're going to do quarterly testing.
Mm-hmm.
And what this does is it gives you a perpetual certification. There's no certification end date. As long as you continue to pass testing, your
Mm-hmm.
certification will continue. Think about what that means from an economics perspective and a market
Yeah.
dynamic. Like, this is no longer this absorbent cost up front and enormous effort up front.
Mm-hmm.
You're able to smooth all of that out. And oh, by the way, you can control degradation and control drift way better than the way that all assessments are done today, which is the
Hmm.
huge spike year over year.
Hmm.
The external assessors, from a utilization perspective, that changes the game for them. They don't have
Hmm.
these huge audit periods in certain parts of the year. They're able to smooth that out. It
Hmm.
changes maybe the economics on how the external assessor actually charges the customer.
Hmm.
Is it this big lump payment, or are you now on retainer, so to speak, with monthly recurring revenue? Like, so
Hmm.
it changes the game a little bit. And I think each organization will build it the way it makes sense for their business. But
Hmm.
that's the way of the future. It's where
Yeah.
the state and federal government is going, the international community is going, but they're only doing continuous monitoring. We're doing continuous assurance. And I
Hmm.
would argue that that's a step above continuous monitoring, right?
It is.
Because,
Yeah.
and this is cliche, but the way continuous monitoring works today is, oh, every month you're going to just send me your pen test results or your vulnerability scan results, and I'm going to check to see if you're closing critical vulnerabilities and by what time period.
Hmm.
Well, that's just one control, right?
Hmm.
We're going to force you to check, test, get validated all the controls over time.
So really
And
what you're talking about is an interim assessment on a more frequent cadence, doing a sample of the requirements, and over a period of time, they all get reassessed.
yep.
So
And
you're just increasing the cadence of
Hmm.
the current level of rapid recert or interim assessment testing, which I think is great.
yeah. And the way that it's being built, and we're still in design phase, but I think it's gonna accelerate here pretty quickly. Uh, we're not going to do a quarter of the controls, a quarter of the controls, a quarter of the controls, and a quarter of the controls. So by the end of that year, you've done, in the E1 case, all 44 controls again. Actually, the E1 will move to 45 controls. But um, we're going to sample by percentage. And the way it's being built right now is the percentage will get smaller over time. Then it'll flatten out.
Hmm.
So the actual effort becomes less. And what does that do when effort becomes less? Cost goes down.
Hmm.
But Richard, as an external assessor, can now do more assessments because he's not stacking them, 14 assessments in the month of October trying to get done before December. He's
Right.
able to do it over time.
Well, it'll also make a really big difference from the client side where, they have tech teams, whether they're developers or IT or, anywhere on the, there are always projects. And then they get to the assessment point and it's like an absolute work stop for the next 10 to 12 weeks. And it is incredibly disruptive, not only to the flows. A lot of people in other areas of the organization don't understand why they ignore maybe the warnings and things that people share out to say, hey, look, we're doing high trust, so March and April are out, just so you know. And it gets very difficult to continue on in business that way. The rest of the world doesn't stop because we have an assessment going, and that gets very challenging, trying to justify keeping all those projects on hold, but then you can't really justify hiring extra people just to do the assessment because you'd have to, the people you have inside who know your business are the ones who really need to be there delivering that evidence and answering the questions and helping guide that information through. So absolutely, I'm delighted to hear about the ongoing assurance, not only from kind of flattening out the spikes in cost and resources, but also from the world is shifting and AI is making things go faster, which means that coding is going faster. And I know that, HITRUST has separate AI assessments, but that AI comes into play, across the business in all sorts of capacities. And just the speed at which things are changing. I went to an ISSA conference, lunch and learn a couple of weeks ago, and somebody said, well, the volume and the pace, the velocity at their coding. How do we convince leadership to give us more, money to hire more people in security? And I'm thinking this isn't quite the right answer. But something like ongoing assurance where you can deliver that ongoing. I later likened their suggestion to hiring more lifeguards for a deep sea fishing, in the storm that went terribly wrong. You don't hire more lifeguards, you call the Coast Guard. It's an entirely different playing field, and you can't use the same things that you used to use, which serve you very well in one capacity when everything has changed. And I think this ongoing assurance is an incredible opportunity at really the right moment to take that forward, so where businesses are releasing times 10 on the volume of code or new functionality, and trying to keep pace with a lot of different changes in their business, which are being enabled by AI, applications in a range of different capacities, and then trying to make sure that they're keeping up with security across the board in this thing that just exploded.
I totally agree with you. The other interesting use case is through the lens of third-party risk management. It makes a more compelling case for HITRUST for TPRM programs that may not flat out accept HITRUST. I mean, their annual due diligence pales in comparison to continuous testing over time. But Donna, I think the second part of your original question was around what's HITRUST doing from an AI perspective to make the assessment easier. And I can tell you that I don't see us developing AI capabilities inside my CSF in the near future for that specific thing. We're looking at doing some other things with AI, but we're going to rely on working with partners who already have it in their tools, right? I mean, we've partnered with Vanta, we've partnered with Drata, we've partnered with ThoroughPass. They all have this AI capability to ingest evidence and map it automatically to controls. And they can push that directly into my CSF. So the days of manual evidence upload aren't there anymore for folks who are using these types of tools. And we're going to probably continue to integrate with other AI-enabled platforms to make the assessment less arduous and hopefully normalize the cost, right? Because if you look at the cost spectrum, and I'll just take the top, I don't know, handful of things that are out there. You've got HITRUST, you've got SOC 2, you've got PCI, which that's always a weird animal in my mind because everybody carves out that environment completely. You've got GovRAMP, you've got FedRAMP, you've got different flavors of NIST. Like if you like from the top, FedRAMP, $1 million, easy. 3-4 years. Like you're going to spend so much money achieving FedRAMP. GovRAMP is probably somewhere in the 250 to 500 range. And these are numbers that I've been given. I obviously have not signed any contracts, but HITRUST, depending on the assessment level, can span anywhere from say 35 to 125. SOC 2 is anywhere from like $2,500 to Richard, what do you think, 40, 50 on the high side, unless it's a really large assessment?
Yeah, unless you go to the big four.
Yeah.
That's double that, but
Right. So with HITRUST is not the most expensive thing out there. We get a bad rep for being really expensive when you compare it to something like a SOC 2 that's being driven down to incredible levels. But using tech-enabled, AI-enabled platforms makes the entire process more streamlined. I don't want to use the word easier because it shouldn't be easier. It should be more streamlined and more efficient. We're still going to require you all, as the readiness partners and the external assessors, to verify that the tool in which generated this evidence and mapped it actually is functioning the way it's supposed to function. So you're not only testing the evidence, you're testing the platform to a certain extent. And there's lots of questions that we're not going to dive into here on how that works. We'll put out guidance on that, but we don't right now. Our thought process is we don't take what comes out of a compliance automation tool as fact. We still want the external assessors to do their job, right? Let auditors audit. So that's really what we're trying to do. But if we're successful, and there's some use cases coming out, I think the cost will normalize. It will come down. It won't come all the way down, but it'll come down. Like there's always going to be a cost to HITRUST. Like
Well, you
there's
kind of want there to be.
well, right.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't like everybody, all the haters out there are like, oh, it's a for-profit company, it's a money grab. The board is, getting their pockets are being lined by, sending their vendors to HITRUST and blah, blah, blah. None of that's true. But if you look at the things that we're doing and we're innovating on, nobody else is doing that. And we have real costs,
Hmm.
right? The fact that we're ingesting threat data itself, just having that threat feed costs money, not inexpensive. And then we have to take that, we have to have analysts take that information, map it to the MITRE ATT&CK framework, do their analysis on the TTPs and the recommended mitigations, and then look at our control set and make decisions on whether we're protecting against the threats that are happening today. And we're doing that on a monthly basis. That costs money. Like there's tons of things that go into HITRUST. So I don't think the cost is ever going to come down. And to your point, Sue, there's an optics thing here that it shouldn't go really low because then the perceived value also
Exactly.
drops.
Exactly.
Right. That's where I was going to go is that the value is still there. The value persists regardless of future changes and that sort of thing. The value of HITRUST, this isn't I go back to the SOC 2. I think we tend to lean that way because SOC 2s are irregulated. There is no central body that's looking at all the SOC 2s to go, right, is there a consistency across how these are being evaluated and how the controls are being implemented? It's not remotely like that. And so a SOC 2 is as good as the, assessor who's evaluating it. And you get some that are, stronger, and you get some from other organizations where that's probably been run through, an AI platform, and maybe they caught things and maybe they didn't. And it's a bit trickier to understand whether that holds value, versus some of the other ones. So I think HITRUST, absolutely, the value is still there. That centralized evaluation and, point of review, even just to make sure that it's not assessor, one assessor is this quality and another one is, way over here. There is an evaluation of what the assessors are doing, which I think is incredibly meaningful, from an end user's perspective, both, somebody who's been on client side and now sits with clients. Those are critical, absolutely critical as far as what HITRUST continues to offer.
Yeah, you hit on something that um, I think is underappreciated and kind of hidden in the trust report around the feedback loop we've put in place to the external assessors. And I'll give you statistics. When escalated QA first started, I don't remember the exact year, 2020, 2021, or whatever it was. Um, as an external assessor at the time, I was like, what the heck is this? And why the heck are you sending it to my client without sending it to me first? But anyway, I digress on that. We had an 11% escalated QA rate in that year, meaning 11% of all assessments were being shoved into escalated QA. And if folks don't know what escalated QA is, I think we're running short on time. I'm happy to come back another time to talk about it. It's not fun. It's actually, as an external assessor, the optics are pretty bad with your customer. It HITRUST has basically said, did you do your job? We're not sure you did your job, so we're gonna take a real close look at your assessment. Anyway, 11%. Last year, just over 1%. So we have trained the assessors on how to conduct better assessments, at least in our opinion. So that feedback loop is really, really important because it just makes the entire community that much stronger. And I don't know anybody else that's doing that. But I think there's a real benefit.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and I do want to be sensitive to everybody's time because we are still in the middle of the business day. But if anybody, or I don't know, Ryan, if your schedule permits you to stay on a little bit longer, or
I could probably stay on for another 5 minutes.
okay. I just had a question to follow up about the continuous assurance. What can we as readiness assessors and validated assessors do to prepare for that so that we are prepared ourselves, our platforms, and our clients?
It's a great question. You're going to have to figure out, obviously, how the contracts will work. Like that's probably most important, right? Both from what are the terms of the contract, but also how are the fees going to be be constructed. But I would probably encourage you to start looking at the controls. It's definitely going to be the E1. It may be the E1 and the I1. We're debating whether we can get both out at the same time. So I would say focus on the E1, focus on the controls and the control frequency, and see how you can start to, make a plan ahead of the curve with your customers and say, hey, this is a daily control, this is a monthly control, this is a quarterly control. Like we're going to need to be prepared to do X, Y, and Z. We don't know what HITRUST is going to tell us the test, but as long as we're prepared up front, then we should be able to react to whatever comes out of my CSF. So
Okay,
that's really what I would do from a preparation perspective is
perfect.
just try to anticipate what the heck we're going to do.
Okay.
Do you know what I
And then
mean?
automate that evidence gathering and reporting as we
As
can, as much as
as much as
possible. Yeah.
possible. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was going to make a comment on earlier is, that certified day +1 recover from the party +2 get back to work. When you get back to work, you're building a pool of evidence. As that monthly control needs to be documented, you take that and you stick it into that evidence repository. You do that month over month. So when testing comes down, you're not scrambling to go back to a year ago to show that it was in place. You've already got the documentation and you just hand it to the external assessor. So it's little things like that that make the process less painful. And I think that will apply to the continuous assurance.
Perfect. Well, great. It has been fabulous having you on. I know we've got way more questions, but we'll have you back very soon, as long
For
as your
sure.
schedule permits. So, and
Great.
look forward to another discussion. Thanks so
All right.
much.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Brian.
thanks,
Thanks,
Brian.
everybody.
Hey, thanks for watching. We really appreciate it. If you got value from this episode, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next HITRUST Secrets. We go live every Thursday at 2 p.m. Central and dig into real-world compliance and security topics. And each session gets uploaded right here after the live show. So whether you're catching us live or on your own time, make sure you're subscribed. We'd love to have you along on your HITRUST journey.